walk the streets of this city is to walk through a culinary history. Corn Market, Bull Alley, Cook Street, all of that has been so well explored by Marcin McAnumra, the food historian, and a previous guest here. But drink also has its place in the landscape. And while Christina Wade's new book, Filthy Queens, A History of Beer in Ireland, what a great title, Filthy Queens, it's not a Dublin-specific book, but Dublin does loom very large over it. Dublin was the epicentre of Irish distilling, and more importantly to her research, it was also the epicentre of Irish brewing and the tension politically around brewing. Dublin has been shaped by its boozy story, and some of you, you're probably listening to this, sitting in a house, be it Watkins buildings or rows of terrace houses in Rialto, that owe their existence to breweries. Christina's book, like this podcast, I hope, does something that I think is important. It tries to put the historic in the context of the present. As we go through this book, she writes at the beginning, I will try to make connections with the past, to tangible places that you can visit now, whether they are buildings that still dot the landscape or the ruins of walls that once enclosed our cities. I will relate to things that you can see or maybe even touch. These might be artefacts in our museums or things that you pass on your daily commute, or maybe even something that was once buried in your town. It could even be your pint glass or what kind of beer you're drinking. And not just things, but also ideas, like the folklore that you can still hear at your local pub or the reasons why we drink at funerals. To put it mildly, I absolutely loved this book. And like the Beer Ladies podcast, of which she is part, there were so many I didn't know that moments as I went through it. So I think you'll enjoy this edition. I decided the best thing to do was to focus in on a chapter in the book called Porter Wars. It's set primarily in the 18th century, examining the tensions that were there in the world of porter. Tensions that were wrapped up in all kinds of things, the relationship with the neighbouring island, for one. And in this story today, we're going to meet some familiar names as we go along, like Arthur Guinness, and some more unusual characters from the history of Dublin, like Peg Plunkett. Busy few weeks. As you might know, I curate the Dublin Festival of History. I'm pretty sure it is, and it is now, because I've said it is. It's the largest free history festival in the world. It runs every year in the last weekend of September and into the first 2 weeks of October. And I can't really say a whole lot about what's in it, what isn't in it, but Christina is in it. So now you know one person who's going to be in it, but I can't say a whole lot more. I promise you one thing, it will be fantastic. And as it gets nearer, I'll keep you in the loop on the programme and when it's going live. But it's been a real joy to put that together over the last few weeks. I've been battle planning like Napoleon Bonaparte to make it happen. For now, enjoy the story of 18th century Dublin and its Porter Wars.
When I'm dead and in my grave, I hope for me a prayer you'll say, and as you're passing by that you will throw in a jar of porter.
Porter, of course, is well known to us from Irish song, like what we just heard from the Dubliners. You know, you could have taken any number of songs that reference the great drink of porter. It's in the poetry of the city today. Louis MacNeice, the Ulster poet who perhaps captured Dublin better than anyone, wrote in his great poem, Dublin, of the bare bones of a fanlight over a hungry door, and the air soft on the cheek, and porter running from the taps with a head of yellow cream, and Nelson on his pillar, watching his world collapse. But what is porter? Is porter stout? Is stout porter? Guinness is often referred to as a porter, but is it one? And it seemed a good place to begin with a beer historian who knows a lot more about beer than I do. What in the name of God is porter, and is it stout?
Yeah, so this is a dangerous question. So in our sort of modern understanding, we think of like a stout as sort of like a stronger porter, so brewed with unmalted roasted barley versus the porter with the malted roasted barley. Um, However, historically, it gets a little murky. So for a time, stouts probably just referred to a stronger type of beer. So there's some amazing beer historians out there, Ron Pattison, and the amazing recently Leighton Cornell, who just wrote a book on the history of porter, talks about um, how, there were such that idea of the modern white stout isn't perhaps as modern as we think. So historically, it's a bit more murky precisely what they are. But yeah.
So we've cleared that. 18th century Dublin is our environment today, a fascinating place, a city we go back to all the time on this podcast. The city was a diverse place. It was wealthy in parts, but greatly divided socially, culturally, and politically. And Christina opens her chapter, Porter Wars, with a quote from Peg Plunkett, once the leading courtesan and brothel keeper of the city. When she published her memoirs, there was, as I'm sure you can imagine, plenty of nervous and very influential men in the city of Dublin. It was not a book you wanted to find yourself in the index of, to say the least. But Plunkett's tell-all memoir, she joked, the prudish were fearful that my memoirs would be totally unfit to be read by any female of delicacy. Her memoir is, on one level, it's about running brothels, but it's also about Dublin as much as anything else, and it's full of great little vignettes and insights into what Dublin was like in the late 18th century. And in it, she makes a comment on beer that is quite telling of the atmosphere of the time. The kind of thing most people would just read at a glance as they read a memoir like this, but Christina zoomed in on.
So I love the stories of Peg Plunkett being this amazing famous celebrity, and so in her older age, she decided that she was going to write her memoirs. And in what could appear to be a throwaway sentence, she basically talks about the amazing Irish porter called Maddox that she talks about, and she says it's better than English porter. And this sentence reveals a lot about porter in the 18th century. So we have, as the title suggests, Porter Wars, and this is Peg weighing in on the side of Irish sort of home, locally made porter. That it almost sounds like, this is personal for Peg.
18th century Dublin, 18th century Ireland more broadly, is consuming a lot of beer. A lot of beer, for all kinds of reasons. It's not just that people really liked it. The absence of a clean water supply, I think, played no small role in contributing to what they used to call table beer. Beer that was just part of the everyday life and consumption of people. Now, just because there was a lot of beer around doesn't mean the beer was particularly good. And Jonathan Swift was damning. He described the beer as musty, thick and stale, and worse than anything except the ale. But as the 18th century progressed, and everything was changing in the 18th century. I mean, the world of trade was changing and was being transformed. There were new questions around porter and beer that went beyond just taste. Origin meant much. Did the glass in front of you, was it made in Dublin? Was it made in Ireland? And as Christina notes, there was a growing sense of a powerful political idea coming into play, and that was the idea of patriotism.
Yeah, so at the beginning of the 18th century, Ireland is producing quite a lot of beer. Like you said, very little imports from England. And then, if people aren't aware, the population explodes in the 18th century in Ireland. Yet the production of of beer decreases and the imports of beer increase, but still not precisely to keep up with what the consumption was in the beginning. So what we see over the 18th century is an overall decline in the Irish brewing industry and a preference for other things, which I'm imagining no prizes for this one, whiskey. Um, so what we see is sort of, as the Porter Wars title suggests, a fight for a smaller market between an English imported porter and an Irish homemade porter, and how this sort of pans out with the side of Irish porter being associated with patriotism and pride in Irishness, and drinking Irish porter was seen as supporting your local country and the cause of Ireland, and that plays out on a grand scale. So it's not just someone coming into a pub and ordering one or the other. It's in laws that are being passed, and these massive arguments being made by Henry Grattan, and we can kind of get into that in a bit. But yeah, it becomes quite a fierce competition for that remainder of the population that is consuming beer.
What was also growing in the 18th century, and probably did no harm for brewing, was a real moralism around spirits, and whiskey in particular, which was regarded, I think whiskey was always viewed as especially harmful and particularly harmful to the lower orders. And even earlier, in the 17th century, the soldier Barnaby Rich painted a picture of Dublin that was just unbelievably grim. He wrote about Dublin as a city with an abundance of rundown taverns, or as he called them, nurseries of drunkenness. It's a great description for a pub, isn't it? A nursery of drunkenness. The corporation itself believed that by 1667, Dublin was somehow home to more than 1,500 alehouses and taverns, and that's the ones they knew about. But into the following centuries, whiskey was coming to be seen as the most harmful of all substances people were consuming. And the Dublin whiskey shops, an early 19th century writer complained, like the London gin shops, are undoubtedly the cause of much intemperance by affording the poor the opportunity of indulging their depraved taste. While the first organised temperance movements wouldn't appear in Ireland until the 1820s, the battle against whiskey had begun earlier in the 18th century. And Christina makes the point that when we're talking about brewing and porter and stout and all of that, simultaneously there are other social questions and social issues.
Yes, there's a lot of sort of middle class and upper class moralizing about the perils of, spirituous liquors, whiskey being one of them, and the dangers, particularly of people of lower economic status consuming these beverages. Now, of course, neglecting to mention that people of their own social classes were also consuming them and getting quite drunk. So, there's a lot of paternalism, the kind of gross paternalism and classism and all those sort of things mixed up in this kind of bigotry towards, which is not to say that there wasn't an issue, but the way that it is framed is certainly quite prejudiced.
But in the 18th century, Irish brewers had influential political friends. Well, sometimes they had influential political opponents, but in terms of their friends, one of them stands today on College Green. I love that monument of Henry Grattan. He stands in the pose of an orator, looking towards his alma mater, Trinity College. A noble parliamentarian, which was a very rare thing in the 18th century, Grattan is synonymous with the Parliament on College Green and the attempts to reform what many people viewed as the unreformable. Grattan went down with the sinking ship, so to speak, and right before the Irish Parliament voted to abolish itself into the dustbin of history, he would say, "I will remain anchored here with fidelity to the fortunes of my country, faithful to her freedom, faithful to her fall." In Parliament, Christina notes, Grattan fought really hard for Irish beer and for Irish brewers. The industry was constantly up against what he and other patriots regarded as very unfair trade laws. Grattan was adamant in one famous speech that we are too near the British nation. We are too conversant with her history. We are too much fired by her example to be anything less than her equal. Anything less, we should be her bitterest enemies. And for brewing and for many other industries, Grattan wanted equality.
Yeah, he really took up the cause. So Grattan was one of the main proponents of Irish beer. He was arguing that they needed to remove the restrictions on the duties and the taxes because Irish brewers were paying way more. Um, he's basically saying, well, of course, whiskey's getting preferred because Irish brewers can't produce their best because all the laws are written in favor of English brewers, and he's really championing them, and his speeches are, and he was successful, and it's really brilliant that we actually have access to all these speeches, um, and he really fought to get Irish brewers an equal playing field in these porter wars with their English counterparts, and it worked. You know, he tried, and eh, I should say over a time period, it eventually worked. You know, people would agree, and then it wouldn't actually end up being, precisely what they agreed to, and then, and he kept pushing. But overall, in the process, he worked hard and saw, results from those efforts.
People were talking that kind of game before Grattan. Swift's famous joke that the Irish should burn everything English except their coal. But we might call that culture the beginnings of a buy Irish way of thinking. And that had interesting impacts on popular thinking. People were publicly committing themselves to the cause of Irish porter, as Christina calls it, that people felt if they backed the business, they were backing local.
Absolutely. I mean, we see there was one person who was, selling porter and took out an affidavit in the newspaper that reprinted over and over, basically saying that he was only going to sell Irish porter, that he was committed to the cause of Irish porter, and that he was, this was his sort of patriotic duty. And that kind of thinking we see full circle back to, Peg and her arguments, and the fact that they mirror these ideas so distinctly really indicates that this sort of idea permeates a lot of people and a lot of writing in society and how people viewed things.
One thing that's really striking about 18th century Dublin brewing, and maybe one of its problems, was that the industry was just absolutely and completely packed. In particular in the Liberties area, but even far beyond it, there were just breweries seemingly everywhere. And breweries generally were relatively small and sometimes very small operations. And I think failure could seem as likely or even more likely than success. It's extraordinary looking at how many people come and go into this industry. There are challenges to be confronted. And we're more than 140 pages into this history of Irish beer before we encounter the larger-than-life presence of Arthur. And I think even that name alone, you know who I mean. And there's not many people in a historical story like this where a first name will suffice. Arthur Guinness. In 1775, this Dublin brewer is in conflict with the city. The city, understandably, wanted breweries to pay for the privilege of using water to brew. And a debate over whether a certain watercourse belonged to the city or to Arthur Guinness himself led to a literal showdown. So the idea of Arthur Guinness, as we're about to hear, battling with the city, that made me wonder, was he now the most famous of all Irish porter men, the shining face of Diageo? Was he struggling in the 18th century?
I wouldn't necessarily say struggling as such in terms of like economic power or how it, but all the breweries in the 18th century did have quite the competition when we're kind of viewing it towards the Porter Wars and what's happening in England. So struggling perhaps alongside the other Irish breweries, I think we can maybe not, struggling as an exception in and of himself. Um, but it's really interesting to see him kind of defending his brewery from, we're talking about these laws and these duties, and this one was about water and access to water, and he's really having to defend his brewery from the Dublin City Water Corporation and, them trying to destroy his water courses and doing so forcefully, quite forcefully.
And going back to Swift's little quip earlier on about Irish beer and the quality of Irish beer, there is a good question to be asked. Was Ireland's beer any good? Because if we were under pressure from Britain and British beer, how did the product actually compare? I mean, there's a couple of things when we think about these two islands that wouldn't have worked in our favour. Economies of scale definitely weren't favourable in comparing the Irish and the British beer industries.
Yeah, so there's definitely an argument to be made there. And certainly a lot of beer scholars have kind of argued that Ireland's beer trade was like, 50, 60 years behind England's beer trade. But part of that was circling back again to these duties. As I explore in the book, they basically are forcing them to buy hops from England, whatever their quality is, because they're charging them so much for hops being imported from Flanders. So it's almost to some degree forcing them to make a subpar product. With that being said, there's also clear arguments to be made that they're just not brewing. A lot of breweries just aren't caring about the quality that they cared about in the early 18th century. And that goes on into the 19th. There are people writing and complaining about the state of Irish beer, saying it just isn't as good as it used to be. But I think you kind of have to combine all those things together to kind of understand. That being said, this sort starts to change when people are brewing porter. English brewers move to Ireland to brew porter, to brew Irish porter, and so that state of play changes.
In time, the politics of brewing became a little bit more complex. So, patriotism, as was embodied by people like Henry Grattan and the other noble parliamentarians on College Green, that was a very constitutional kind of patriotism. They ultimately believed, I think, Grattan and those around him, that an Irish parliament with real power and real authority and real voice on the world stage could exist within the framework of an empire. But by the late 18th century, that constitutional nationalism is joined by the idea of republicanism. Within the Society of United Irishmen, you had the Sweetman family, brewers later on of what they called Superior Leinster Ale. If you're going to call a beer anything, call it Superior. And as R. Madden, the great historian of the United Irishmen, put it, the business of a brewer was a hereditary pursuit in the Sweetman family for upwards of a century. Their brewery was on Francis Street, the site later becoming the Ivy Markets. It's kind of ironic, isn't it? Because that's part of the Guinness story of Dublin. But the Sweetmans and the Guinness family were very much in different political camps. While Guinness were firmly unionist and saw Ireland's place in the empire, the Sweetmans were committed to breaking it.
Really, brewing is a political battleground, and I believe Sean McGee made the argument that due to the penal laws, a lot of Irish Catholics were barred from so many different positions, but they could brew, and so this was a way that they could acquire wealth, and they intermarried, and he explored this in his article, which I cite in my book, and it was a way to acquire some kind of power in a system that really did not want to give you an inch of anything. Um, and so a lot of breweries use that to support the cause of Irish patriotism, of Catholic emancipation. We'll see with Daniel O'Connell later on, with the Deasy Brewery later on, directly supporting these causes, supporting Daniel O'Connell, supporting um, politicians and, things that would help them in their communities in the long term. So breweries are very much on the front lines of the political arguments and the politics in 18th and 19th century Ireland.
And if in the 18th century, porter wars were primarily about trade and commerce, 19th century drink wars were to be very different. The arrival of a very famous name, O'Connell, into the brewing game put real tension into politics in Dublin. I always thought about Daniel O'Connell's movement as a sober movement in all kinds of ways, naturally complementary with the temperance movement, which was happening around the same time when Frederick Douglass was in Ireland, that escaped American slave who so loved Daniel O'Connell. Douglas also met Father Theobald Matthew of the temperance movement. He gave me a beautiful silver badge. I now reckon myself with delight the fifth of the last five of Father Matthew's 5,487,495 temperance children. And when I think about Daniel O'Connell's massive rallies, the monster rallies, as they called them, 300, 400, 600,000 Irish people in one place at one time, I always thought the sobriety of the temperance movement was probably how that was able to happen. But one of O'Connell's sons saw opportunity in the brewing game. O'Connell was forced to distance himself from the beer bearing his name when it began appearing, but that didn't stop his image being used to sell beer.
Well, his son, of course, acquired a brewery for a while, and so O'Connell himself had to actually distance himself from it because of the rivalry between himself and Guinness. So he had to actually say, "Look, I don't have anything to do. This is not something that I own." Whether or not that actually played out privately is something up for debate. But he definitely had to say this, and they would later trade on. Daniel O'Connell calling beers the Liberator, and they wouldn't be the only brewery to do that. Quite a few breweries would try to weigh into that. So he does find himself very much tied up with um, with politics, and even we have a brewer who passed away, and famously wanted to be buried, was going to be buried in St. Kevin's, and the local the vicar there, because the brewer was Catholic, refused to let a Catholic priest do the ceremony, and so this sparked off a huge issue, a huge blowback, and so some scholars have argued that this actually helped O'Connell establish like Glasnevin and Golden Bridge cemeteries so that Catholics could have a place to be buried. So it's so entwined with O'Connell's cause of Catholic emancipation, and we really see that in the story because the story of beer is as you say, it's very political. And I don't think you can throw a stone in the politics of the 18th and 19th century without being able to start somewhat circle it back to beer and brewing.
It was perhaps inevitable that some breweries wouldn't make it. And after the days of the Porter Wars, consolidation very much became everything. The scale of Guinness is absolutely extraordinary. I think sometimes we forget the physical imprint of Guinness on a map of Dublin. And as Christina reminded me, we're talking about a business that was building houses, that was exporting its product in unprecedented ways. Crucially, a company that was taking advantage of changing infrastructure and transport. Some Dublin breweries were looking at how do we get our product into the Midlands and the west of Ireland. Guinness were looking at the bigger question of how do we get our product into the world. And when the famous brewing and distilling historian Alfred Barnard came to Ireland, he went to 10 breweries, most of them in Dublin: Phoenix Porter on James's Street, RD Street Brewery, Anchor Brewery, Mountjoy Brewery, Arthur Guinness and Sons. Now, recognise any names there? They really were the last men standing in some ways.
It absolutely was about consolidation. So the railway network, other scholars have argued, and I would agree with them, made it possible for the big Dublin breweries to make inroads in smaller towns that would have had probably their own local brewery or their own somewhat close producer. And so they kind of took over. So it is consolidation, it is the name of the game. And by the end of the 19th century, we're talking about massive breweries. So Guinness itself is 42 acres. They have their own railway, they have their own fleet of ships. It's big in a way that I don't think any of us can really fathom. They had two purpose-built communities for their workers at Bellevue and Rialto, like huge, huge places. And then the other big ones are still, 3, 5, 7 acres. So we're still talking about big breweries producing um, beer for people all over the country, and a lot of them would be located right here in Dublin, sort of in the Liberties area. And then, of course, when that all then gets further consolidated as the 20th century moves on. But yes, we're talking about brewing on a scale that even in the mid to early 18th century was just unfathomable.
I debated with myself forwards and back for a fortnight what dimensions of this story I would ask Christina on to speak about, because this really is a far-reaching book that brings you from St. Bridget in times gone by to a sense of Irish brewing in recent times. And the title of her book, Filthy Queens, as I said at the start, it's just a magnificent title. Women are a big part of the social and economic story told in this book. But the presence of women within the industry, that's one dimension of this that I find really, really interesting. In a country and society and an age where so much was off limits to women, brewing was very much a family game that women were often involved in at surprising levels. Some women inherited breweries, but all were important to their operations. And amazingly, we read in this book about elite rural households, landed estates, where there were often privately run breweries producing alcohol run by women. Research shows that the fourth most popular category of recipe exchanged amongst women between the 17th and 19th centuries were recipes for alcohol. I mean, the story of women's involvement in all of this is really, really interesting.
Absolutely. Women inherited breweries. They maintained those breweries. I mentioned briefly the DZ brewery. It was inherited by a widow who then passed it down, her portion down to her daughters. So women absolutely inherited breweries. And I think this is also having to do with centuries of brewing have been something that women would have done in the household, would have been familiar with. So it's something that women were experts in for such a long time. Even at the end of the 17th century, we have widows and single women running big commercial breweries. Big for the 17th century, not big anywhere near the scale of the 19th century. But breweries in Dublin, the bigger ones, the more significant ones. So women had this position for a long time. So, particularly in the 18th century, it was natural then that women would brew with their husbands, or their husbands would own the brewery, but the women were brewing. And then when it became, a bigger enterprise, and someone would hire the brewer, but the family would still run the brewery together, or they'd run, the brew pub together, and it made sense for this all to kind of work out. And we see that even in the 18th and 19th centuries, where people are talking about, oh, my husband has passed away, but I'm still going to brew to his quality here at such and such inn. Please come down and visit us. We're going to, keep it up to quality. So women were still actually physically brewing, or physically managing the direct day to day of brewing. Um, it, and not necessarily just, so far removed from it as brewery owners sometimes could be. So it is quite interesting that women were still there, certainly not the numbers they had been in previous centuries, but we still find them.
So what you've heard today is just one dimension of Christina Wade's book. Congratulations to Nine Beans Row, the publisher. They're publishing some really excellent stuff on Irish food and drink history, compendium of Irish pints, J.R. McMahon's book, An Irish Food Story, 100 Foods That Made Us. I really don't think this is the last of their books that we're going to be featuring on this podcast. So I really, really recommend getting stuck into Filthy Queens. And as I said, you can hear Christina talk all about it when the Dublin Festival of History rolls around later in the year. Thank you so much for tuning in. Bloomsday fast approaching on Monday. I hope you have a good Bloomsday weekend. Next week also brings, I should say, the 18th of June, the 150th anniversary of the Dublin Whiskey Fire. And I think we'll go back to that. We had a podcast episode on that in 2020, but a lot of new research on that subject by my father has revealed new and surprising things. So we might be looking at that again. Keep an eye out for his book, little beautiful book on the shelves about the Liberties Whiskey Fire. But for now, slán go fóill.